So I wanted to basically give you some examples where it's not equal, where in the last example, the buyer paid $1 and then the seller paid $1. So in panel A, there is relatively elastic supply, and then you have, look at the demand. So you have a flat supply. You also have pretty much an elastic demand. Buyers bear most of the burden of the excise tax. So in this case, look at what happens if, say, you have the tax. It looks like buyers pay the majority, sellers pay the least. P1 is your equilibrium. Your tax is basically from that, between the two lines, you see where your tax is, and you see how much the seller pays, which is very little, the buyer pays most. The seller is more elastic. They can leave and get out of it, where the buyers are less elastic and they actually have to pay more of the tax. So in panel B, look how the supply changed. The supply is very inelastic, it's very steep, and then the buyers, the demand curve is more elastic. With a relatively inelastic supply, the seller pays most of the tax and most of the burden. So you have the buyers pay some, but the sellers pay the majority of the tax. So that shows a different one. In C, with relatively elastic demand, sellers bear most of the burden of the tax. Look at that. The elastic demand is more elastic than the supply. So in this case, the sellers bear the burden of the tax and the buyers get out of most of it. So the sellers pay more than the buyer. And then in D, with relatively inelastic demand, so you've got a very steep demand curve, and then the supply curve is relatively elastic. In this case, the buyers pay most of the tax. So as you can see, whoever is more inelastic pays the majority of the tax, no matter whether you tax the buyer or the seller, doesn't matter. Whoever is the more inelastic, where they can't move and they can't change, they can't get out of that transaction, they pay the majority of the tax. And the taxes are pretty much equal in each, in the cases. There's not one that's it's like a $2 tax. In this one, if it's a $2 tax, I would say the buyers pay $1.75 and they pay 25 cents for a $2 tax. Here it looks like the seller's going to pay maybe again the same kind of thing, $1.50, and then they pay 50 cents, but realize the sellers pay most of it. Here again, the sellers pay most of the $2 tax, so this might be $1.50 and this might be 50 cents, or it might be $1.75 and 25 cents. And here again, the buyers pay the majority of the tax. This looks more like a $1.75 and this is 25 cents. But you just see how it goes with the tax. Whoever is more inelastic and more steep in all of the transactions pays the majority of the tax. Now, if they're drawn equally, where they're both the same elasticity, they share it equally. So hopefully this makes sense to you in a graphical position where you can actually see it and who pays most of the tax.